Good morning, church. Just want to thank you again for having me up here with y'all again. It's wonderful to be here. And you know, I've always considered myself a storyteller. You know, even when I don't mean to tell stories, I just find myself telling stories. You know, maybe it's one of the reasons why I like giving these messages so much, because it gives me a chance to tell some more stories. But really, I mention this because I'm going to start today off with some storytelling. I have this story that I believe is going to serve an odd yet somewhat lighthearted gateway of sorts to our gospel story. So a little while back, my family and I were traveling around various parts of this country, down through the Appalachian Mountains, then to the south, on a sort of ancestral journey, if you will. We were exploring the areas of Casey's ancestors, and we were trying to connect with them in different ways, like visiting their towns, getting records like birth and marriage and death certificates, and going to the cemeteries where they were laid to rest. We were going back many, many generations, so we were led pretty far off the beaten path, like up a snowy mountain in the middle of nowhere in West Virginia. That was an incredible experience. But then we got to Scotland, Georgia. And that's the place where most of Casey's mother's family came from. It's a town of only a few hundred people, and the population had collapsed just a few years prior, and now it was truly empty and abandoned. And I live in a tiny village right now. But this was totally different. It was just one empty storefront, a fire department that I'm not really sure was in business, one traffic light, and a cemetery. And we were there to go to the cemetery. And it was a tiny cemetery, very old cemetery, where many of her family members were buried. There were sand roads, and again, middle of nowhere, nothing around. That's unsettling for me as a New Yorker, because our strength is in numbers. But we went ahead and found the graves, and we were making a rubbing of a headstone when out of nowhere we saw a car pull into the cemetery going very slowly. And it came closer and closer to us and pulled up right next to us. And there was a man staring at us, sweat coming down his face, and he looks deeply at us, like he's thinking of what to say. And then he goes, "See all the vultures?" and points up to the sky. And yes, there were vultures everywhere, and I had not noticed them, but now I was very aware of all the vultures. Because why is that your intro? But then he continues, "You know, that's an option when you die, to put your body out for the vultures. People do it. I've thought about it. But you probably don't think about that, do you? You're too young to die, but you never know." Now in that moment, I was fairly certain I was going to die right then. And I was fairly sure he was going to be the cause of that death. But the story does continue, but you know, we were able to edge away. At one point, we ended up running out of that situation. Now I mention this story because it is funny and horrifying, and I'm grateful we're all still alive. But somehow it fits into the story of Lazarus and Martha and Mary and Jesus. You know, death and how we deal with it, how we think of it, it's difficult, it's complicated. You know, we were in a cemetery to connect with those who came before us, but the guy in the car is probably right. I don't think about dying too much. And he's also right that you never know. And this story from the gospel is full of feelings about death and life, and feelings of responsibility for death and lessons about death and life. It's a moving story that I think could take us in many different directions today, especially with Palm Sunday and Holy Week right around the corner. But today I want us to think of this story in ways in addition to Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead. Because to me, this story reads as so much more than that. You know, it involves many people and many emotions. And it's really a story I can relate to, like, a lot. and many of us probably can, as someone who has lost friends and family members, and especially a sibling. It hits me like right here when I read and hear this part of the story. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at Jesus' feet and said, "Teacher, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the people who came with her also weeping, Jesus was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Jesus said, "Where have you laid Lazarus?" They said to Jesus, "Teacher, come and see." Jesus began to weep. I relate to the feeling of the sisters. You know, the "had you been here" feeling. Wanting or needing or feeling compelled to blame, or not so much as blame, but question and second guess what happened or what could have happened and what could have been done. What more could we have done to save someone we loved? Was there something anyone or someone in particular could have done to save this other person? I think of it with my brother Donald all the time. Was there a message I could have responded to? Or if I would have visited him just one day earlier, could I have gotten him to the hospital? Or if I would have talked to him more, would I have gotten a better idea of how sick he was? I've spent years wondering if there's anyone who could have saved him. And if there was, why didn't it happen? I felt and still do feel like Mary in her moments. If you had only been here, Jesus. I have felt that way around loss for sure. And even with Jesus, if I'm being honest, thinking, where was God when God was needed? It's a part of grief and mourning, and it's hard. And it's not always very helpful. But it's what Mary and Martha were feeling, and in the outpouring of emotion, it is what was shared to Jesus. And I think that part of the story is important. This outpouring of emotion is powerful, and it really affects Jesus. And then Jesus begins to weep. Jesus weeps. It's such a powerful thing. And it's given me comfort many times and still kind of shakes me up a little bit when I hear or read this story. Because to me, it's a reminder that Jesus wept for his beloved. Jesus weeps for those that he loves, and it makes me know that Jesus and God weep when our beloveds are lost. And this reading comforts me to believe that God wept when Donald died, just as I wept. And this right here makes me think of when someone passes. There's always someone that I think says, well, you know, it was God's will. God had this planned and God needed this person. And I've never believed that. And this gospel, the story of Jesus weeping for his beloved, gives me comfort in knowing that God weeps too. The world is a rough and scary and unfair and unjust place. And I can't live with the idea that our God is somehow part of it. That God plots and plans who lives and who dies, who makes it and who doesn't make it. A God that is love is a God that weeps when a beloved person is lost. And that is very important to remember from this story. And I want us all to remember that today when we leave. And that is that God loves us and views us as God's beloved. And God weeps when things are difficult and when we mourn and when we have loss. It's important to remember. God is always with us and loving us even if we can't or won't or don't feel love. And I'll stop just short of quoting the Footprints poem, because you know I'll do it. But I'll let you know that this gospel gives me faith and hope that Jesus and God stand with us at all times. From the crying out of the sisters, Jesus is there and deeply moved. From our crying out, Jesus is there and deeply moved. Also important in this story, though, is the raising of Lazarus from the dead, but also the what and how and why Jesus tells us why the miracle is occurring and how it's occurring. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Oh God, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When Jesus had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead person came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said, "Unbind Lazarus and let him go." When Lazarus comes out, he's still wrapped in his burial clothes. They're not gone. They will be needed again, but now is not the time for them. Jesus has brought Lazarus from the dead and has given Lazarus another time at life. But really, for the sake of everyone, it's for the sake of the whole. Mary and Martha, everyone around, all that see, all that will hear of it, and all of us that hear of it now. And that to me is such an important reminder. This is for all of us. Lazarus is raised from the dead for more people than Lazarus. It is surely important to Lazarus, don't get me wrong, but it isn't only important to the one that is spared or the one that is saved. And I'll be the first one to say that God has saved me and brought me back from deaths. Not literal death like Lazarus in the story, but God has brought me back from tinier, yet very important deaths. Like the death of love, or the death of self-love or compassion, or the death of my spirit.
Yes.
From very low points, God has lifted me and brought me to new ways of being and living and loving and loving myself.
Yes.
Love has shown me that. A God that is love has shown me that.
That's right.
And importantly, it isn't just about me. The person that is saved is not the only one that is saved and not the only one affected. And I think we can apply this out all through the world and our lives, right? Just think of someone you know who has inspired you or does inspire you because of something they overcame or were saved from. Like, I think of James T. Lane and how much he inspires me and how much he means to me, how much his story means to me. And when I see him on Broadway, and I've been seeing him on Broadway for years, I've got to tell you, I just sit in the row beaming from ear to ear with pride and inspiration. You know, he's one of those people that keeps me going and believing in myself when I don't want to, but because I watch him believe in himself. Or think of the story of Reverend Elder Troy Perry and the founding and origin of MCC. Reverend Perry was saved when he heard the message that God knew he was gay and loved him. And then think of how many of us he has saved and inspired with that message. I include myself in that list. I know for certain I wouldn't be up here without Troy Perry and his witness. The saving of one will impact many. I believe that so much. And it makes me think of a story I just read out of Brooklyn, that there was a calf in Canarsie who was being sent to slaughter. But this calf got out. Has anybody heard this story?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
So the calf ran through the streets. Video caught this cow running around, There are slaughterhouse workers trying to lasso the cow and take the cow back to the slaughterhouse. But the calf would have none of it.
Sure wouldn't.
Vincent Fontana, owner of Original Pizza across the street, said she was feisty. She didn't want to go. Eventually, the cow was cornered and returned to the slaughterhouse. But people that saw this started protesting the return, saying that the calf deserved to be free. People spoke out seeing the video, saying that the spirit of the calf showed that the calf deserved to be spared and given another chance at life. So an animal sanctuary in New Jersey came straight up to Brooklyn, and eventually, with the help of those who had witnessed the escape, convinced the slaughterhouse that this one cow be saved. So the cow went to the sanctuary. Many other cows were not saved that day, but this one was. The director of the animal sanctuary said, "There's something about the one animal that fights to survive that people identify with.
That's right.
It affects people. The one saved makes other people think."
Yeah.
And maybe that's what these people are going to think about. I know my path to becoming vegan started with just one mouse stuck on a glue trap. So it may be the case of a calf who wouldn't give up. You know, that spirit might be inspiration for others to never give up. And there are so many examples we have. There's another example just out of New Mexico this past year, where the Senate there passed a bill banning life sentences without the chance of parole to people who committed crimes as children. The bill not only outlaws these sentences, but becomes one of the first states to create meaningful pathways and systems and programs for rehabilitation, for pathways to life after prison, for those who committed crimes during their childhood, a time that doctors say that the brain is still developing and people are growing and changing. The new law is not a miracle, said Carissa McGee, who herself was incarcerated for many years. She spent years helping convince lawmakers to vote for it by sharing her own story of redemption. And she says it's not going to fix everything. And it's not going to open the door for everyone, but it is powerful and can provide hope. She herself spent 9 years inside a prison for attempted murder when she was 16. And she says the law gives a light to people who have hope for a light, but there was no light before. Seeing people like Carissa who have turned their lives around gives hope to others who are in hopeless feeling situations. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and Lazarus has life again. Mary and Martha have their sibling back, but so many have hope and have new life. So many know that God is a God of love. In that story and today, that is what we need to be focusing on. That God is a God of love who weeps at injustice and suffering and intolerance and hate. Not a God who judges drag queens or queer people or anyone who is living their life. So many people know that God is a God of love, but not everybody does. We know that. There's lots of people that don't know that. And we who know that need to change that and help everyone know who God is. A God of compassion and one who stands with us and for us. And does so for all of us, for the whole family of the world who so desperately needs hope with all of the war and injustice and poverty, racism, sexism, and all the many, many other forms of hatred in this world. We need hope, and we need to know that we can have new life now, today, or new life tomorrow, Tuesday, whenever. but a new life is there for us. God is ready and standing next to us when we need it. Amen.
Amen.